The Holy Gospel according to Luke. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make three dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud, a voice came that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then, a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly, a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. The gospel of the Lord. Well, uh, what a strange scene we have here. Remember, the disciples had been falling asleep, and finally they, even though weighed down with sleep, as it said, they were there to see this, what we call the transfiguration. Now, of course, it puts us in mind of what we saw happen to Moses when, remember, it says in our Old Testament reading, our Hebrew Bible reading today, it tells us that Moses was clothed with brightness and light. He had to put a veil over his face. This is kind of remembering that. And Elijah, of course, was taken up into heaven in the fiery chariot, we are told. And some rabbis, by the time of the first century, they were even saying that Moses wasn't really dead and had not been buried, but Moses himself had been bodily taken up. After all, no one saw Moses die. No one saw Moses be buried. Even in Peter's letters, it tells us that Michael the archangel and Satan disputed over the burial place of Moses. Still, by the time of Jesus, they were saying that Moses had been taken up too. So here are the two who they're believing have been taken up into heaven. And here's Jesus now, glorified like them. But they mistook what the glory was, I think. They saw brightness. They saw, something miraculous. Here's Moses, here's Elijah. And yet when Jesus comes down, they don't say anything about it. Peter, being Peter, said, "It's good for us to be here. We can build three tabernacles, three dwelling places for you." Now, was Peter a carpenter? No, he was a fisherman. And yet he's talking about building these dwelling places. Well, every Jewish man, every Jewish head of a family, especially, knew about building dwelling places because in the Festival of Tabernacles, also called the Festival of Booths, they knew how to build these temporary uh, tabernacles, these temporary dwelling places where they would dwell during the duration of the festival. Is this maybe during the time or shortly after the festival? Could be. And so that's on Peter's mind. Hey, this is a good thing. We can build three tabernacles, one for each of you. And then comes the cloud that overshadows them and scares them. And it says that they entered into the cloud. And they heard a voice say, "This is my son, the chosen. Listen to him." Nice way of saying, shut up and let Jesus do the talking. Well, not only did they take that to advice right then, but they kept that advice and didn't say anything to anybody. They came out, and as soon as they come out, a man comes running up. "Rabbi, my son, he's my only son." Just this quick comment there. Luke is very concerned with orphans, with widows, and with families that have only one child. He's very concerned about those people. They were considered the most fragile members of society. Luke is very concerned about them and certainly talks about women more than any of the other gospel writers. Anyway, so Jesus says, "Okay." And the man says, your disciples weren't able to cast this thing out of my son. It mauls him. It throws him around. He foams at the mouth. He hurts himself. Jesus goes, "Oh, you faithless and perverse generation." Who's he talking about there? I don't think he's talking about the man, because the man clearly was coming to Jesus for relief, for help for his son. I think Jesus might have been talking about the disciples. Faithless. Ah, you twisted, perverse, twisted, and faithless. You should be able to do these things. Jesus told us that the things that he did and more we would be able to do because he was going back to the Father and would send the Spirit to us. I'm still stuck on the seeing Jesus in glory, what that transfiguration meant. And what does that transfiguration mean for us? I think that the transfiguration of Jesus, the glorification of Jesus, was in him extending himself in love to us on the cross, to show on the cross that no matter what you do to me, I'll still love you. No matter what. We talked a little bit about this last week. On the cross, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." That love is what transfigured Jesus. That love is what transfigures us, continues to transfigure us. That's how we're changed into the glory of God. That's how we take on the glory of God. Seeing through the eyes of God. And I know I talked about this last week, but I can't get away from it. I haven't been able to get away from it all week. Seeing through the eyes of God allows us to be transfigured as well. That we look at those who have wronged us, we look at those that we hate, and we have to keep looking for the thing that makes them human. We have to keep looking for the God inside of them. We have to keep looking for the Christ inside of them. We have to keep looking for the thing that makes them human. We look and we see the things that, oh my, we begin to see their frailty, not their anger, not their monstrosity, not any of those things. We begin to see their frailty. And when you see someone's frailty, a heart of compassion, a heart of love begins to carry that weight. I think about people that have wronged me. That's okay. People who have said bad things. It's all right. And I keep looking, and eventually I see it's almost like seeing the little child in them, the place where they got hurt. And the minute you see that, it almost becomes impossible to hate them. We have struggles even among our friends, among our families, among our church family. But if we look through God's eyes and see what makes them human, what makes them frail, what makes them lovable, then we can change. And like I always tell you, that change takes day after day after day after day. For some people, you can see them and, okay, yeah, I'm changed immediately. Some people, it takes a long time, or I should say, a constant practice of it. You wake up the next morning, having forgiven them the day before, and then you're triggered by something, and you got to do it all over again. It's okay. That's okay. That's walking in love. That's walking in forgiveness. That's walking in agape, the love of God. I told you some weeks back, I'm probably going to spend the rest of my life talking about the love of God, because that's the ball game. If we understand the love of God, we too can be transfigured. We can be transformed into the likeness of God's dear Son. And that's what we're looking for. Thanks be to God.